Hello, this is Hiroshi Yamazoe. This time I will talk about my parents and family relationships because I received some requests on YouTube comments to talk about my relationships with my parents and family. But before I begin, I would like to say that this will be a dark story, even more dark than the last video where I talked about my trauma. But I think it's important to tell the truth, including the painful events of the past, because it will give me some relief from my past experiences and the viewers will be able to get some kind of reference from the true story. So let's begin. First of all, I was born in 1984 as the youngest of three brothers. My brothers are each 6 years apart from each other. So my eldest brother is 12 years older than me. And when I was born, my father was about 40 years old and my mother was about 36 years old, so I was born when my parents were relatively old. My grandfather's generation was experienced World War II. My paternal grandfather was a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army and dead in the Pacific War. And my maternal grandfather was also a soldier of the Imperial Japanese Army, and he survived the war, but he had a bullet wound in his leg. He was gone by the time when I was born. So during my childhood, I lived with my mother, father, paternal grandmother, and 2 brothers. We were living in a small town in the countryside of Shiga Prefecture. We lived in 2 houses, a 2-story house and its detached house, and our family owned some fields and a paddy field and a mountain in the area. My father was a civil servant. He was the sub-deputy postmaster of a post office, and my mother operated a gardening supply store in the shopping district of my town. And they were not rich, but they were not so poor, and we lived a just ordinary life. And next, I will talk about my family relationships in my childhood. Throughout my childhood, my father was a quiet man who rarely spoke, especially to me, and he was often became very angry and abusive. He was always negative and aggressive towards me. I don't know why, but my father always seemed to have the mindset that he wanted to punish me. I felt like he hated me for being born from the very beginning. I wasn't sure why my father was like this to me, and I wondered maybe if he wasn't actually related to me biologically, but he was real father biologically, and at that time my father treated my brothers in a similar way to me. So I don't know why, but I think he hated his own children. I did not have a good impression of him. On the contrary, my mother was a very kind person. In my childhood, I used to watch TV with my mother a lot, and she often bought me games and cooked my favorite meals. And she also drove me to other cities when I asked her so. And she even gave me a dog named John. I loved him very much in my childhood. He was my best friend. I lived in the countryside and used to run around the fields and mountains with him a lot, and I still think of him often. He was energetic and cheerful and helped me feel better when I was sad. In my childhood, my dream was to buy a house with a big garden somewhere in the mountains and let the dogs run free and live together. And this is a little off topic, but I will talk about it. This is that I had a sad separation from my dog. One day I heard my dog scream very loudly, and then I heard the neighbor's family's mother yelling, やめなさい. I went over to see what was going on, and I found a big wound in the flank of my dog, and it was bleeding, and next day my dog dead. Apparently, the neighbor's kid had lured my dog out and stabbed him with some kind of sharp stick. It seems he did it just for fun, like the people who were bullying me I talked about in the last video. I think children often do very cruel things. I think we should not only look at children as cute and lovable, but we should also be careful about their dangerousness. And now let's get back to the subject. I was talking about my mother. My mother was a very nice person who gave me a dog and often cooked my favorite foods, and she often buy me something or take me somewhere when I asked her to. She was a very caring and kind person. She was very nice not only to me but also to my brothers, and she often acted as like a translator for my father, who was almost impossible to communicate with me. And so even when things didn't go well because of my father, I think my mother managed to keep the family functioning. And now I will talk about my brothers' relationships. As I mentioned earlier, I have two older brothers who are 6 years apart from each other, Actually, there was another sibling between my first and second brothers, who was my sister, but she died of a disease before I was born. And my eldest brother and I didn't talk much because we were 12 years apart, but he was a lot like my father. He was very angry and aggressive with me often, and I didn't have a good impression of him. And instead, I played a lot with my second eldest brother, who was 6 years older than me. We spent a lot of time playing TV games together. He and I were very good friends. And my grandmother was a person who did not have much presence in the family. She didn't talk much to people and spent a lot of time alone in her room watching TV. She was also an avid Japanese Buddhist and spent a lot of time chanting Buddhist prayers in front of her Buddhist altar every day. My parents worked together, so when I came home from school, they were not there, so I saw my grandmother a lot. But like my father, I didn't have any particular conversation with her. In my childhood, I didn't have any bad or good impressions about my grandmother. I spent my childhood in a family like that. I didn't get along with my unfriendly father or eldest brother, but I think as in an overall, including my mother and the second eldest brother, the family functioned as a result. I was given food, a place to live, clothes to wear, and so on within that family. I was just grateful to my family and had no particular frustrations with them. Of course, I had a lot of small frustrations with my family, but I didn't think they were particularly bad people, because I think we all have many and different problems, including myself. So, on overall, I think my family doing okay. But in an instant, everything was broken. This is because my experience of being bullied, which I talked about in detail in the previous video. My experience of being bullied led me to stop going to school and became a long-term hikikomori. The moment I stopped going to school, my mother suddenly changed completely. First of all, my mother excluded me from the family dinner table when I was 13 years old, when I started to stop attending school. She said, "There is no food for you," and excluded me from the dinner table, and the other family members did not say anything about it. I was very hurt by this exclusion, and I felt very unspeakable discomfort. It was like as if I had escaped from the bullies by becoming a hikikomori, and now my family was bullying me. Excluded from the family's dinner table, I was so hungry that I couldn't stand it. So in the middle of the night, I went to the refrigerator and picked up some food and ate it without permission. And after that day, I began to dislike eating with my family at the same table anymore, because I read the atmosphere that eating with me would make my family members uncomfortable. So I became like this. And during the time I was in Hikikomori state, my parents attacked me hard repeatedly in many times. My father beat me, pushed me, threw me in front of my mother, and my mother didn't say anything about it. It was very creepy to see the expressionless faces of my father when he was beat the shit out of me. And one day my father beat me so badly that I had covered with bruises. So ironically, in my house that I escaped from the bullies, the exact same thing happened to me that when I was being bullied. I think for my parents, it was a horrible and absolutely should not happen that their child stopped going to school. That's why they punished me so severely when I didn't go to school. I think that to describe about this, two Japanese concepts are important. Those are haji and seken. Seken means local community and haji means shame. Japanese parents have seken to deal with, and it is a super haji in the seken for to have a child who is hikikomori. Haji is an important concept in Japan, and often receiving haji is more painful than dying. In Japan, some people kill themselves because they are suffering from haji due to some kind of failure. And it happened as I answered when I was interviewed in a Japanese weekly magazine before. When I was around 14 years old, my mother came into my room and choked my neck with her hands. And while she was choking me, she shouted, "Shine, shine." Shine means die. But there was no strength in her hands. She just grabbed my neck gently. It was as if she was sending a message to me like, "You should kill yourself." This event was a huge shock to me. This has remained as another trauma for me to this day. Then around the age of 15, when my parents tried to break into my room to punish me, I myself fought back and violently attacked them. As I got bigger, I was able to fight against my parents after this point, the age of 15, and I fought my parents physically, and I also did some rampaging in my house in an uncontrollable manner. At the time, we lived in a newly built house, and I beat up the walls of the new house and made many holes on them. This seems to have been a great catalyst for my parents to change their minds. I managed to remind them that violence against me would result in the financial loss of holes in the walls of the new house. After that, my parents were no longer violent towards me, but instead they started to ignore me. They began to neglect me, treating me like as a non-existent person in the family. And in the meantime, my two older brothers graduated from college and went to work as normal people. And then one day, there was a symbolic event at my brother's wedding. In this event, he never introduced me as a family member at the wedding, and I was the only one who was not in the family photo at the wedding. I became a non-existent person in the family. After physical attacks, the next step was to ignore me. I was felt in a state of neglect as someone who should not exist. I spent most of my time locked up in my room with no communication with my parents and anyone. I spent about 10 years in such a state of neglect. So my parents didn't attack me in any way anymore, which made me feel much better mentally, but I felt like I was slowly being killed. There was no hope for the future. I think my family was probably hoping that I would kill myself as soon as possible, as I was an inconvenient person to them. At that time, I wanted to kill myself as well, but I was afraid to do it, so I kept postponing it. I think that at the age of 13, when I became a hikikomori, if my parents had been able to communicate with me in a normal way, and if they had been able to take a diligent and step-by-step approach to helping me recover from the Hikikomori state. I think this problem could have solved quickly. For example, my parents could have transferred me to a different school. But unfortunately, my parents did not have the love for me to do such a thing. Rather than helping me, my parents chose to abandon me. However, they didn't completely abandon me, and they allowed me to live in their house, and they allowed me to get food from the refrigerator, and they allowed me to use the computer and the internet. But if my parents kicked me out of their house while I was underage or with no ability to live on their own, it would mean they had abandoned their responsibility to protect children as parents, and they would be charged with a crime. So I guess they had no choice but to make me live in their house. In this state of neglect, I spent a long period of time as a hikikomori with suicidal tendencies. However, as I have said in other videos, I gave up on suicide and chose to live, and voluntarily went to a support facility for hikikomori. So I did rehabilitation and then got a job. I was employed as an employee of a welfare facility. This was my first job. As I have said in other videos, it took a lot of work to reintegrate myself into society like this after being a hikikomori for about 10 years. Then I thought that now I got a job and returned to society, my parents would approve of me. However, even after I got a job, my parents did not approve me. I think my parents did not want to welcome the fact that I, the shameful hikikomori-san, who was supposed to be a non-existent person who had been keeping it hidden in the house, was going out into the world again and becoming a person who exists. I think it was like exposing their urge to the second for my parents. So my parents just hated my presence and continued to ignore me. And then around the age of 24, I finally became completely independent. As I have said in this video, I rented old and cheap apartment and lived in extreme poverty. It was a very poor life, but by achieving complete financial independence, I was able to leave my parents completely. But when I was in my 20s, I went back to my parents' house several times. However, my parents were still very unfriendly. For the last time of the when I was staying at my parents' house, the final words they said to me were "Dete ike," and That's how I completely disconnected from my parents to this day. I haven't seen my parents for almost 8 years now. But the strange thing is that is how it all went okay. About my two older brothers, one of them is a civil servant and one of them works for a big company in Japan. They are married, they have their own houses, and they have own children, and they seem to be living happily with my parents too. My parents seem to be living happily with these two brothers too and their grandchildren. I have seen pictures of my parents with their grandchildren, who are my brother's children, and they looked so happy and smiling. Everything fell into place for the better, including myself, as I went away from them. Now I myself do not hold any anger against my parents, but rather I am thankful for them. I think my parents treated me wrong way. They hurt me very much as a child and ripped me to shreds and then threw me away. However, ironically, I think there are many people in Japanese society who are suffering because they are cherished so much by their parents. For example, there are many people in Japan who, even in middle age, can only live under the protection of their parents. I think if parents love their children so much that they continue to give their children to so much money and care and affection and so on, that even when the children become adults, the children often become people who cannot live without under the protection of their parents. It is a very common phenomenon in Japan that children become spoiled by their parents and become dependent on them even after they become adults. There are many people in Japan who, even at the age of 30 or 40, are still living with their parents. But of course, if they are happy with that, that's great. However, in many cases, it can be a tragedy for both parents and children. I'm not a strong person, so if my parents were very generous and gave me so much money, things, and so on, maybe I would still be stuck at home, and it would have caused me and my parents a lot of suffering. I think it is because parents treat their children cruelly sometimes that children stop depending on them and become independent. In the natural world, parents feed their children up to a certain point, but when they grew to a certain level, they stop taking care of their children and exclude the children who come to them. This allows the child to live on its own. I don't think my parents were good parents, of course, but I'm glad to see the result of encouraging my independence from that. Because they were bad parents, I came to believe that I had to live on my own because I could not depend on them at all and they could not spoil me. So it is very ironic, but now I am grateful to my parents for treating me in this way. And that is not the only reason why I am thankful to my parents. My parents are the one who created me, and I would not exist if they didn't exist. I am thankful to my parents from that perspective as well. And I think this point of view remains the same no matter how bad the parents. Thus, with gratitude towards my parents, I would like to just go my own way and be independent without having anything to do with my parents anymore. I am convinced that by doing so, my parents, my brothers' families, and me will all be able to settle into a better situation. And I think everyone will be happy. So this time I talked about my relationship with my parents and family. Recently I have been posting videos that talk about my trauma and dark past. However, I would like to post videos on this channel that are simply enjoyable too. For example, travel videos. I would like to travel somewhere by myself again and introduce that to you on this channel. So I will continue to post a variety of videos on this channel. If you are interested, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching.